Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at a process for colouring line work that is broken. In the last few videos we've been taking a look at solid line work and some methods using fill tool and paintbrush for colouring in solid line work like you see here. But what happens when your line work is stylized in a way that the actual pixels in the lines don't necessarily meet up? In other words, there are holes in our line work. We're going to take a look at sort of what happens in this circumstance. So using the normal brush tool method that we watched in the first video in this series would work perfectly well for this. You can just use the brush tool and paint in using your drawing tablet or your mouse. If you're not using a drawing tablet and you're not really that confident with colouring in with the mouse, the techniques that we used in the previous video for that was to use the magic wand tool to select an area of the character and then use the fill tool or the fill option to colour it in. But the problem with the magic wand is that if there are holes in the line work, the magic wand tool won't really work the way we want it to. So if we zoom in here, we can kind of see what's happening. We've got the head of the character and there are some holes in the line work. There are some holes here just along the top where the forehead meets the hat brim. And there's also a big hole here in the line work where the pixels in this line here on the side of the face don't meet up with the line work pixels on the brow. So what that means is when I do a selection, the selection, if I'm clicking in this area here, what we want it to do is just select the area inside the line work, but because there's a hole here, the selection gets outside the shape and then also selects all of the area outside of the character as well. So the resulting fill that we would get, if I create a new layer here just so you can see what happens, the resulting fill we would get for that would be something along these lines. You see? So it's going to basically, it's essentially selecting everything in the document that doesn't have a solid line around it. The areas here and here, the fin and the torso and this arm, are not filling because their line work must not be broken. There must be at least one pixel bridging any of the gaps around this line, so the selection was not able to get in there. So you can see that the wand tool is not necessarily going to be the best option for trying to colour areas if you've got a very stylized line work where it's like a crayon or a charcoal type line, something that's very rough and broken. So how do we get around that? I'm just going to remove that layer and I'm going to deselect my selection. You can deselect, don't forget, by going to select, deselect, which is Command or Control D. Okay, so what we're going to do is look at another option that you can use with a mouse. And it actually, for me, I'm actually more comfortable doing this with a mouse than with a Wacom tablet. I'm going to come up to my 3/4 view folder because this is the 3/4 view, and I'm going to create a new layer in there for my fill. I'm going to rename it. I'll call this one green. Actually, no, I'll call this cyan fill, because I'm going to change the color palette up a little bit, and I'm going to drag this down underneath my outline. So I'm keeping the same kind of organization as I did with the front view. Okay, so I'm going to select my color, and I'm just going to change the color palette up from this one a little bit. So I've got my color panel open here. Once again, you'll find that under the window menu just here. And I'm just going to use the hue slider on the side to pick a hue or the spectrum, color spectrum, and I'm going to go in there somewhere like a minty green, almost cyan color, and just pick a tone and a brightness and a saturation, something like that will do me for now. Okay, so I can't use the wand tool because it's going to select everything else. So what I'm going to do is switch to the polygonal lasso tool. So I'm going to click and hold down on the lasso tool and just make sure I've got polygonal lasso tool active. That's L on the keyboard, and Shift L to cycle through. Okay, so once I've got this tool active, what I can do is zoom in on the area I'm going to fill, like this. And what I'm going to do is place my cursor in the middle of the line work, like this. I'm not going to try and do it sort of right on the inside edge of the line. I'm just going to go right in the middle. And I'm just going to left click. And I'm going to work my way around, and I'm going to left click as I work my way around. Now you can see where I go from the head into the brim of the hat. I'm just going to go right up into the middle of that line in there. Like that. And over here what I'm doing is looking at where this line comes up, and I'm sort of extending up from the back of the headline to the middle of where it would intersect with the hat line, sort of up in here, and then I can bring it down like this. So keep in mind, this is sort of, the line work's rough, and so parts of this line work are not going to have the color on it. So around the outside of the character you're going to get this sort of nice rough line work edge that doesn't have the background color in it, or the fill color that we're adding in here. Notice on these parts I'm not clicking lots of little points along. I'm just going from here right across to where this line is, like that, and then back up to here. So when I get to here I can either double click here and it will automatically close from where I double click across to where the selection started, or I can move my cursor to the beginning of the selection, and you can see I get this little circle appear next to the cursor, which indicates that if I click it will close the selection. So if I do that, you can see now I get this dotted line selection running around the line that I've clicked, like that. So I'll just zoom out so we can see this in its entirety. There we go. So you can see that selection runs sort of around here. Now, what this has essentially done is given us the same kind of resulting selection that we would have gotten if we'd have used the magic wand tool and then expanded it by a couple of pixels like we did in the previous video. But this has allowed us to do essentially the same kind of selection but across broken pixel line work. Now all I have to do is use my preferred fill method, either Alt Backspace or switching over to the paint bucket tool, making sure the all layers option in that tool is switched off, and then clicking inside the fill area. I'm going to do the fastest method, which is Alt Backspace or Option Backspace on a Mac. Here we go. And that's filled my line work up. All I need to do now is deselect the selection, so I can just go Select, Deselect, Command or Control D, and I now have my fill. So if we zoom into that area where the gap is, you can see that the color basically across that gap doesn't have any outline on it, but that's a sort of a nice style where you get this nice broken line but you get a nice solid fill. So all I need to do now is go right around the whole model with my various colors. Once again, make sure you keep different colors on different layers, and that way it's easier potentially to do shading and things later on. But that's essentially another mouse-friendly process for creating fills within Photoshop. Now, you can also just use the paintbrush as we've done in previous videos. So for instance, if I switch over to my brush tool and I grab my stylus, I can just on my fill layer, I can actually just go in and fill those areas. Just as with the solid line work style that we had on the front drawing, if I go outside the lines, I can go back in and clean them up with an eraser. Okay. So if I want a style where the line work is sort of being adhered to, I can just flip my stylus over and I can erase any edges of the colour that drop outside the line. And all I'm doing here is sort of erasing the colour up to roughly the midpoint of where that line would actually join. So I can just work my way through. Now, another option for the line work style that we've got is to actually have the colour come outside the lines a little bit like this, so it's a little bit messy. You might want to sort of keep it at least controlled in some fashion, rather than it being like super messy. So for instance, now my brush is a bit big for what I want it here, so I'm going to right click inside the document and then from the pop-up just reduce the brush size a bit like that. What I can do is sort of just brush over deliberately over sections of that so that I get a bit of line work or a bit of colour bleeding outside the edges like that if I want. So you can play around with different styles like that. You know, so for the fin, for example, what I could do is trace over that like that, so that it's a bit messy. It's got like a more of a hand kind of coloured feel to it. So you can have overlapping colour, or you can have sort of constrained colour inside the line work. Okay, so yeah, if you've got broken lines, the polygonal lasso tool works well. The final note that I'll make about that is the lasso tool, the regular lasso tool, can be harder to control with a mouse, and it can be tricky with a stylus as well. I'm currently using my stylus at the moment. With the normal lasso tool, you've got to have a pretty steady hand, because it will it'll draw wherever it'll draw the selection. My feather is turned up here, which is why I'm getting that weird kind of blobby selection. So if I turn that down, you can see it'll select exactly where you draw. So if your lines are very thin and you don't have a very steady hand with either your mouse or with your drawing stylus, you might find it harder to control where that selection is, and that's why the polygonal lasso tool is much more accurate. Okay, we'll leave this here, and I'll see you again soon.